Subscribe to The Honest Critique for current affairs, movie, book, and product reviews. Also, make sure you press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video. The views, information, or opinions expressed during the video series are solely those of the individuals and do not necessarily represent those of The Honest Critique and its employees. The following video contains strong language which may be offensive to some viewers. Viewer discretion advised.
So hello and welcome to another episode of Security, Intelligence and Terrorism series, which is going to be our last episode. And in this episode, we have someone who has inspired me to take up security studies, look at terrorism, and I thought this is the best way we could end the series because he was the first guest we have on the series, and I thought since life's a complete circle, let's end the entire series with him talking about his research process and if he could guide a few young researchers to take up to take up search on the similar subject. So today we have among us Kabir Taneja. He is a fellow with the Strategic Studies program at ORS. His research focuses on India's relation with West Asia, specifically looking at the domestic political dynamics, terrorism, non-state military actors, and the general security paradigm of the region. He is also the author of the book The ISIS Peril, which if you want to have want to see the discussion, you can go and check out the first video recorded with him. So, Kabir, thank you so much for taking your time and being on the show. It's an honor and a privilege to host you.
I get asked very, very often. In this kind of work, from afar at least, there is a sense of romanticism to it. You have access and all that kind of things. So hopefully I clear it in a way that people stop bothering me after some. Yeah, I mean, these kind of spaces are still like extremely open and there are not enough people working on it. There's a lack of culture in India from universities specifically to let people pursue these things. So it's a very sort of self-determined, self-promoted, self-absorbed kind of thing that if you get into it, good. Otherwise, there's very little sort of infrastructure around. Unlike, let's say, in the States or the UK, where it's quite institutionalized.
Yeah. So, Kabir, tell me, what got you interested in studying West Asia? Because a lot of scholars here in India focus most of their research in China, Pakistan, or the West, but they have rarely studied the West Asia. So, what got you interested in West Asia? And if you could tell about your journey a little bit so that it could inspire a few more young researchers to take up a similar field.
I grew up in a very sort of an environment where international relations and foreign policy and politics in general was discussed as evening conversations. My father was a journalist for 30 years, was a foreign correspondent for 30 years. And my uncle, his younger brother, is a professor of Indian and Chinese politics. So there was always, whenever he used to visit, so he doesn't live in India, but whenever he used to visit, both my dad and my uncle is sort of, what at least used to be the center left, and my dad is slightly center right. So there's always a good sort of, debate that used to happen when I was a kid. And I used to usually always sit in and just listen and, just try to understand what topics they're talking about. And so, it comes from that. It comes from living in a household where these debates were general and normal. And once I started going to college, my interest peaked much more, especially towards the Middle East. Always found very odd that such little interest in public discourse was given to this region, considering and migration, energy security, economics, everything historically has been very intricately aligned with the region. And of course, the Middle East itself has a very sort of tumultuous, interesting history of fragmentation, of states being created overnight, states being destroyed overnight, rise of ethnic militancy, rise of, I mean, the continuous sort of playing out of the Israel-Palestine issue, which shapes a lot of geopolitics there, and so on and so forth. So I always thought that this discourse is lacking. So when I entered the media space here, also it was extremely difficult. You know, the larger newspapers would not give you sort of space to do anything. Long form is a very long shot in India anyway, but um, uh, there was not much interest, let's say, in going a little bit deeper into what role does Hamas play in Palestinian politics, for example. Kind of thing. So, it started from there, and I came out of college. That is, started was a journalist for some time. That's when the Islamic State started sort of, the Syrian crisis and the Arab Spring were just beginning in 2010, 2011, and again very little interest in India for some odd reason. So I decided just to fill up the space, as simple as that.
Yeah. So, what was the initial literature you read about West Asian terrorism? Because there were not much Indian researchers still now as well writing about either West Asia or
Yeah.
terrorism. So, what would you suggest someone who's starting out?
Look, there's no easy way to answer this in any discipline, right? I mean, it totally depends. If you want to learn more about the theoretical framework of Orientalism, that's one way to learn through the hard security aspect. You read IR, you read security studies that do not necessarily have to relate to the Middle East, right? So your sort of understanding literature of international relations and foreign policy, you ideally, I it's again a very personal way of how you go. So people who prefer to go, uh, uh, reading up more about, let's say, the ethical conundrums around foreign policy, ethical conundrums around the concept of interventionism, and so on and so forth. So, or you could go the other way, which realists point of view. So realism is something that I think is a concept where around which foreign policy revolves largely for most states. So it's very result oriented. How you get those results are often not the most morally or ethically correct mannerism in which policy should be conducted by a state, but it is what it is. It's how the world works. Uh, I found that in your 20s, specifically young scholars who are beginning their journey, it's very important to, you know, go through the motions of what you think, right? So if you do think, pacifism is something that should be inculcated in global thinking as a foremost way of how foreign policy and politics is conducted, do not let that go. Let it play out. You will eventually come to a realist point of view. It's just the nature of the game. But that journey that everyone takes as a journalist or an academic or a young scholar or someone who's just interested in these issues, I think it's very important to go through the motions of what you think first, and then let it evolve as you read, right? As you research, as you learn, because a lot changes from what you start with and where you end up with. And at some point, you will realize where you stand, and that stand is going to become sort of your fulcrum of thinking, right? Of what you think of what the international order is, of what you think why terrorism exists, or why or how you should counter it, and so on and so forth. So I will not give specific reading examples because I believe that stifles the process that everyone should go through, which is read anything and everything that comes your way if you're interested in a said topic. And don't get caught up into, I'm not going to read Chomsky or I'm not going to read Kissinger, and I'm, because I don't disagree with him or I agree with him too much, and so on and so forth. Read every viewpoint that you can, specifically if you're a young scholar. You will eventually find your own footing of your thought process, of what you believe in, and so on and so forth. So I'm not going to give you suggestions to read. I would just say read as much as you can. All of the researchers that work in this space, give them a fair chance of allowing them to offer you their thought processes, and then you have the freedom to whether agree with it or reject it.
Yeah. So this is another question which is related to that, and this is one question we got. It's like, what's the importance of studying things like, for example, history, or for example, economics? Because a lot of people, a lot of researchers actually have seen when they have to analyze incident that happened, they use their lens. For example, you might use security. Somebody might use the economics angle to it, or the historical context of why this is unfolding. So the question is, since IR is multidisciplinary,
Yeah.
how what's the importance of studying the others fields which are not related to your I mean, your either expertise or your interest? What are the
Yeah.
importance of studying that?
It is. I mean, it's changed a bit, right? So when I was in college, and I'm talking as if it was decades ago, but I finished my masters in 2011, and throughout my bachelor's and masters, I did journalism. That was sort of uh, the continuity as far as academics go. And at some point in the middle, I realized that an outright or a traditional journalism degree is increasingly irrelevant now, right? So they will tell you how to work a camera, or they will tell you how to work audio equipment, or they will tell you how a newsroom works, which is all a little odd, considering you will get real life experience anyway in most of those things. So if you're talking, and I mean, if you're talking about, let's say, journalism, just as an example, I would rather recommend or suggest people who are thinking of doing that to take a discipline instead, right? Go with economics, go with history, go with political science, or whatever it is, because all of those can lead to journalism. You don't need to study journalism to actually enter the workforce in the media. But if you do come in, let's say today, with an expertise in macroeconomics, or an expertise in IR, or if you have come with an expertise in political science specifically, I think it offers a much more of a cushion, right? So even if you want to move forward from journalism 10 years down the line, you can still go back to these disciplines and do something within those disciplines. So it offers great amount of flexibility. But I think it's extremely, I wish I would have done, for example, a much more narrowed down which I did later on, but that required then you to do an extra degree, and it's a cost thing, and so on and so forth. But I think going through a a process where you come out from, let's say, your higher education, if you want to get into research and journalism, that is, or any of the byproducts of these fields, it's best to go for a specialized uh, discipline, right? So you do your history, you do your economics, and it's going to help you tremendously into understand the world much faster than a sort of more vague degree like journalism would.
I completely agree because I have a journalism honors degree, and a post bachelor's. My first thought was, what do I do with it? Because I know
Yeah.
how to write, but I don't know what to write on.
Mm.
Because that's
Exactly.
journalism
And to
doesn't
be
teach.
honest, I mean, writing is something you do enough, you'll get not maybe not tremendously excellent at, but you'll get good at. So it's all about how much you actually write, right? Your first few articles are going to be shit whether you like it or not.
Yeah.
So you just have to cut. I learned a lot after. finishing my degree and just writing anyone who would publish. Right? Even if someone would say, I have a personal blog which reads 6 people, can you write for it? I would write for it. There's no harm in sort of not doing that. But it, it not just sharpens your writing skills, it sharpens your um, understanding of how you want to conduct your research on what you're writing. Right? You understand the shortfalls in the ecosystem that you work in, and you understand what's realistically available to you to pursue the topics that you want to research on. For example, something very basic in India. I'm not sure. My degrees are not from India, but how do you work the National Archives? How do you do research at the National Archives? I learned that when I was 26, which is ridiculous, right? And that too, my very generous colleagues who are pursuing PhDs, allowed me to just tag along with them and just spend time with them and understanding how do you read catalogs, how do you access old newspaper films. They still have films; it's not all digitized. So all that, no one in journalism or in political science in DU, I'm not sure anyone does that. So yeah, so I think it's unfortunately in India all these things take time, right? I mean, we only recently have started seeing people are now okay with not doing an engineers or an MBBS or whatever, right? They're okay in going into these other fields. We have universities like Ashoka coming up that offer good quality, degrees in social sciences and humanities and in liberal arts and all that. So more and more people will go this. It will improve over time as the economy is able to support what comes out of these educational institutions, right? So, but a lot of it at this point of time comes down to you, your entrepreneurship or behind what kind of research you want to do, and how much dedicated you are to get off the internet and social media and actually be out there, right? So you have to throw yourself into it. Don't be afraid of fieldwork. Don't be afraid of uh, meeting people. I find a lot of young scholars are very hesitant in meeting people now, right? And I'm not sure where that comes from. Maybe it just comes from that digitally sending out an email or a LinkedIn message is extremely easy. But that's not an ideal way of going about things. You have to learn how to talk to people, how to deal with people, what to say when not to say anything, all these things. When you have to be a listener and when do you have to be a talker. So all these things will come as you meet people, as you do field work. So real world experience has to stay on top. Just publishing 5 blogs is not enough.
Yeah. So the next part is about the ISIS, which is something a lot of people might want to know. So how did your interest peak in ISIS, a group in the Middle East?
Yeah, so I mean, it's in 2014, 20. I mean, this is my interest did not peak on ISIS. It came from the Arab Spring when the Arab Spring started. I mean, it was a tremendous visual spectacle, right? It's in the protests in Tahrir Square. How it just started, right? It was something that we see in India all the time. General small time vegetable seller picked on by the cops and who set himself on fire as he was sick of paying bribes or whatever it is, being part of a corrupt system and all, and it spread from there. So the story is quite tremendous. And by the time it came to Syria, of course, uh, it's I mean, Islamic State did not come up in and around the Syrian crisis. It came up in and around the Iraqi crisis, and has roots in the American invasion in 2003, and so on and so forth. It's called Al Qaeda in Iraq earlier, but it was largely a show of a guy called Zarqawi, who managed to create a name for himself, right? And of course, His name was fairly regional till General Colin Powell mentioned his name as a critical threat to American security in, I can't remember the year, but maybe around 2004, 5 or 6, I can't remember, or maybe later. So, while all this was happening, again, not enough interest in Indian public discourse. A lot of Indian public discourse on foreign policy is very, of course, Pakistan centric. Uh, China has now, of course, come up in a major way, and rightly so, about time. But Pakistan centric, Western centric, what if an Indian Prime Minister would go to Washington, D.C., I mean, the number of journalists that would follow was always fascinating to me, while we had no journalists covering in the entire Middle East region. I mean, considering we have 7 million Indians working in the larger Gulf region, I don't think any Indian national daily has a permanent presence in the Middle East. So all this was very surprising to me. So it drew me more towards understanding why, and also understanding, how does this region, which has historically been very fractious and has been riddled by wars, was created, boundaries were created overnight by the Brits and the French, and all of them are still struggling with those sort of historical baggages. So the interest came from there. ISIS just happened to be there at that point of time. And even when it was growing, it was growing in a very unusual manner, in the sense that, of course, it was conducting brutal attacks in Syria and in Iraq, but it was also gaining territory. It was managing to sort of control territory like a government, like a quasi government. It was putting up taxes. It was forcing population to recognize itself as a quasi government. At a point, it held territory that was larger than the land mass of the United Kingdom throughout Iraq and Syria and so on and so on. It was a major event, and there was just not enough interest in India at that point of time. And thankfully, I was working for a fairly smaller newspaper at that time, and my editor was more than happy to give me space to pursue stories that no one else would, I'd imagine, put in print. And a lot of these stories, made it to the front page of this small newspaper. So I had a lot of freedom. So working for a smaller newspaper helped tremendously to tell a bunch of stories that no one else would probably be interested in. Usually the answer comes up and says, "What's in it for India?" But it doesn't have to be always that, right? If it's a major global event, India can see it from a position of it being a major global event. So that tremendously helped. We did a bunch of stories when the Indian, there were those 39 Indians who went missing into Iraq, whose remains were found later on in Mosul. I remember I got in touch with a freelance journalist. Others call them fixers. It's not a right term to use, in my opinion. But we got in touch with a freelance journalist on the ground in Iraq, and I worked with him over 6-7 months. And he came back one day and said, "Look, there is, without a doubt, it's been confirmed to me that they were shot dead and they were killed. We're not sure what happened after that." But this was a good 1 year before, 1.5 year before the Indian government said, "Yeah, we are not sure that their remains have been found and stuff." So I was able to do that because of a small newspaper. So and I think that's takes a bit of conviction, because you have also letting go of a nice payday, maybe, in exchange for following what you want to do. And there is a sense of course, coming from a relatively privileged background, that I could afford to do that. So but these are the small sort of tricks. If you want to pursue something which is fairly narrow, look for avenues that will publish it, right? And it doesn't have to be, going after the big names and the good big mastheads working in the big newsrooms. That will often stifle what you want to pursue, right? They will say, yeah, that is all very good, but just do, I mean, read couple of AFP and AP wires and come up with a story and put it up online. That's the thing. But I pushed myself also in the initial days. So like 2013, 16 kind of phase, I did a lot of field work. I applied for grants that had nothing to do with my reporting, just so that you have money to actually conduct field work. So it's not, none of it is easy. So if you're looking for a cushiony, comfortable positioning of yourself, then this is maybe not the correct way to go about it. But if you're interested enough, you'll make it happen. That's the sort of bottom line.
Thank you for that answer, because I think it gives a lot of people a sense of understanding what your situation was and how did you conduct your went about conducting the research analysis. So let us come to techniques, and I think this is a part that you guys ask the most of how you go and conduct your research. So especially an organization which like ISIS, uh, of how you would you discriminate? I mean, distinguish between your primary and secondary sources, because a lot of researchers, for the benefit that they cannot go and meet people, especially or get in touch with people who have been part of the organization, mostly refer to secondary sources. And I think I was reading one of their papers, and it says that most of the papers that comes on terrorism are just a resurfacing of the previous available information. So no new information mostly comes out for this. So, how do you go about your research and get your primary and secondary sources? And if you would cover the media aspect of as well, because ISIS has a huge media aspect, and I think you're talking about the jihadist media. How you use that, because it's a tool for them, operational as well as recruitment tool. But how do researchers use that tool for their advantage to research?
Look, I mean, it's not easy in any shape or form to research these things. In the sense that, I mean, we were sort of reporting on Islamic State when they were building their ecosystem. So, and at that point of time in the beginning, so 2014, 13 era, they were freely, available on Facebook, Twitter. The sympathizers were there. They were trying to recruit. They were spreading their propaganda without any pushback from the platforms, because the platforms were not. First of all, I think they never factored in that they could be used for this kind of materials, and they had no answer to it, because if you start ad hoc sort of pulling down posts and censoring and those kind of things, then it opens a can of worms. Someone else will stand up and say, look, if you're doing that, why aren't you doing it against the Maoists in India? Why aren't you doing it against n number of such entities that are operating in various political spectrums? So I mean, I remember, there was a case called Shami Witness, who was a guy who was a Twitter handle and had like 30, 40,000 followers, predominantly those who were interested in the Islamic State. And he used to propagate, telling people how to reach Syria and Iraq to join the Islamic State, why they should do it, it's the correct thing to do, and so on and so forth. And no one knew who he was because it's an anonymous account. Uh, and I remember talking to some Intel folks who were like, we think that this is some person of South Asian origin, um, in and around London somewhere, like in the United Kingdom somewhere, who's operating this account. And turned out to be a guy who's a software engineer in Bangalore instead. So and I used to talk to him on Twitter like a normal DM. So I used to send him questions like, not probing why you are doing this. This is wrong. I'm not being, you have to step away from uh, often from being preachy and moralistic, as I said. And I was just curious of why he was doing this, what the propaganda, I mean, what the ideology was, what was the selling point, why he thought, and I mean, at that point of time, we didn't even know it was he or she. So, why they thought people should, leave their families, leave their loved ones, and travel to Syria and Iraq and join Islamic State. And he used to answer very candidly. It was as simple as that. You DM and you got an answer. So, just because there was no pushback from platforms, the platforms were uh, still figuring it out what to do, right, with these accounts. And even when he was, finally arrested in Bangalore, it happened because of a Channel 4 documentary in the UK that sort of I mean, the Shami Witness fellow only turned up and interviewed there. It's at that point, at that during that phase, it was very easy because they were all over the place. Facebook, Twitter, multiple Facebook groups, only discussing Islamic State ideologies. If I mean, people who had managed to join Islamic State outside, such some of those who were, let's say, former Indian Mujahideen and Simmi, uh, uh, were using social media as a way to try and organize people who showed inclination towards Islamic State online and organize them in an offline world. So they were trying to do that, and it was fairly easy at that point of time. There was no pushback from Twitter and Facebook and all that. That started changing when, slightly at least, or from a global point of view, during the Westgate Mall attack in Kenya, when Al Shabaab live tweeted the terror attack. And that time people were like, Acha, we need to address this situation. I mean, you can't have terror groups live streaming or live tweeting these kind of things. So, I mean, we managed to make contacts with some sympathizers at least during that period. And from a researcher perspective, I till date am, I mean, in touch with at least some of them. So, and most of them have, gelled back into society because propagating ideologies online is not a crime. So if you go online and say, Islamic State is great, the cops can, and NIA can come to your house, arrest you, but it doesn't stand very far in court. So you just go back to the life you came from. Of course, I mean, it's used as a tactic to get you scared and sort of pull you away from those activities. So it's not easy anymore because now the platforms have pushed back. So Twitter does not. You don't find a lot of Islamic State stuff on Twitter, and you don't find a lot of Al Qaeda stuff on Facebook and stuff. But it's still there. It's still fragmented. It takes time for you to build an ecosystem on multiple platforms for, first and foremost, for people who run these platforms online to realize that you're not law enforcement or something like that. That you are, to realize eventually you are a researcher or a journalist and stuff. And at least what I have found is, the Islamic State's, for example, online ecosystem is now very fragmented, right? It's very disorganized, and that works in their favor. So, I mean, if someone comes up and says, "I'm taking out Islamic State magazine for the sake of discussion," let's say from Maldives tomorrow, that doesn't have to have a financial or hierarchical green light from the Islamic State. They can do it. They can use the name and they can crop up tomorrow, and the Islamic State is just going to co-opt it, right? So they didn't start it, but they'll bring it in. So the landscape has changed. It was very earlier on. It was very easy to research. Now it's much more challenging. They use multiple platforms like Telegram, like Rocket Chat, much the smaller ones that have a harder time regulating their own spaces, because there'll be an app like a messaging app which has, let's say for the sake of discussion, 15 million users, but 4 people running it, including one engineer. Right now, that one person or 2 people cannot go sit and go through uh, tons and tons of data to pull out who's posting, let's say, stuff that is sympathetic to Al Qaeda or Islamic State or whatever it is. And they take advantage of these smaller ecosystems, smaller online ecosystems, right? But I would just like to clarify, because I know there are a lot of young researchers who see this as a exciting or something that one of the most common questions I get asked is, hey, how do I get this Islamic State's Al Naba magazine? Like, where do I subscribe? Like, it's not a subscription, right? You can't, it's not out there that easily also. But there have been instances. So if you are, let's say, a young academic or a young researcher, first and foremost, if you are looking to getting into this kind of research, I would highly recommend not to do so as an independent. If you are affiliated to a university or a research institute, talk to them and get your projects green lighted, so that you have an institutional backing. And now there are other more safer avenues, such as this website called jihadology.net, which is like a repository of materials where you find, such as Al Naba magazine and all that kind of stuff. But you need to register with them. It was an academic register basically earlier, but now it has been you know strengthened by an organization or an NGO called Tech Against Terrorism. And so you can access these materials safely there, right? So there is no malware, there is no you will not have non-academic, non-researcher people just downloading it and then distributing it and so on and so forth. So you can go and register there. They will see whether you are the correct person to give access to or not. So if you are a scholar who's affiliated to, let's say, a university or a think tank or a research group, and make a good case that I want these 5 issues of Al Naba or Sawt al Hind or whatever it is, and you can easily access them at jihadology.net, uh, which has been a very good uh, outcome in the past couple of years, that researchers got together with tech companies and said, look, we want to offer a safe space for researchers to work here and not roam around aimlessly on Telegram looking for things. Because how things are going on tech companies being pushed to work harder against extremist materials, giving safe spaces to terror suspects and so on and so forth, it's becoming increasingly not safe to aimlessly search Al Naba, Islamic State on Telegram, and so on and so forth. So, for example, I still get access to a lot of Islamic State or materials because of maintaining an ecosystem for the past 6 years, right? So, even if platform, let's say on one of these platforms, a room is shut down, which posts these kind of things, the next room you get invited to, so you don't have to search for it, right? So as it's a spiral thing, so they know who you are. They know they can take, if you're a journalist, they know they can take advantage of you. I mean, you will help them in getting on the front pages of national dailies, and that's what they want, right? At the end of the day, I remember there was a Italian journalist who was kidnapped by the Islamic State in Syria or Iraq, I can't remember. I think in 2017, 2018, and it was released a couple of months later. And one of the things that he came out uh, and said during an interview with BBC was, uh, you know, one of the realizations that he had was, look, they use us to get to the front pages. It's nothing else, right? They are just not happy with being in a telegram room. They are happy with being in the front page of the Washington Post. That's what they want, right? And they were succeeding for like a long period of time. A lot of they use that space between journalism, which the journalist should do. Like tremendous work was done, despite some allegations now by Rukmini Kalamaki and so on and so forth. But it did put Islamic State on a pedestal as well, right? It did put them on the front pages. It did put them uh, possibly as a much larger than life entity than what it was. But so technology is something that is not exclusive to anyone, and more so it's not exclusive to law abiding states and citizens. That argument does not fall anywhere, right? It's fair game to anyone and everyone. So it ultimately comes down to services and how they want to deal with it. So a lot of our ecosystems that I roam around in are sort of cyclical and spirals from what they were in 2014, 15. So it's the same sort of, I'm not sure if it's the same people because everyone is under an alias, but it's the same sort of digital ecosystem that have changed over time, changed their apps or whatever the platforms that they have been using. They go to smaller platforms now. So not a lot of Facebook, not a lot of Twitter because they get taken down very quickly. Telegram is still seen as a safe space. But there are others who you get invited to. One is called Hoop. There is another one that comes up next week called Rocket Chat. They'll change to something else beyond that. So they look for smaller entities, but almost always get invited to those now, right? So you need, I mean, if you know how to find it, you'll still find it, but it's not easy anymore. And I say this that, do it as part of a university or a research think tank, so on and so forth. If you want to go down this road, don't do it as independents. I mean, the legalities that are increasingly being attached to this kind of research is quite tremendous. So if something does happen, you will need a institutional backing for you to pay legal costs or whatever it is, right? And also it can happen, if you you know you're doing this, and there's some agency somewhere sees it as just pro-Islamic State or pro-Al-Qaeda content, and they end up at your front door, and those kind of things. So increasingly it's becoming much more challenging. So you really need to know what you're doing, how it's done and stuff. There are some very good papers now on how this kind of research is done. Don't ask scholars to put you in touch with rooms. No one is going to do that, and no one should be doing that, because you as an independent or a undergrad student or a master's student getting access to this without university or institutional backing is something that is not advisable at all. I get these messages every day. How do I get access to this? And I said, there's some sense of romanticism to this kind of research. It's increasingly becoming difficult. It's increasingly getting wrapped around legal discourse from states, as a lot of these groups are now banned legally. So Islamic State is banned in India legally. And for example, Taliban is not, so they are on Twitter, right? Those kind of things. So it's, if you want to go to places like jihadology.net. They have tremendous selection of these kind of materials that you can use for academic research in a safe space without getting into any trouble. Avoid, falling for this, oh, I got access to a Islamic State room, it's really cool. It doesn't work that way. That's not a good way to go about things. And if you are going to research these areas, do it in an institutional, safe, and uh, in a manner uh, which will not put you in harm's way.
Yeah. So I have like two last questions. You covered a lot of grounds on that. So some of my questions got answered. So about a lot of people want access to open source intelligence as well. And I think you get a lot of messages on that as well. Like, how do I get access to open source intelligence? You can give information of for researchers who are starting. If you can give a basic idea of how and how to get access, if not access, of how to go about it. And the second,
Yeah.
since you mentioned about shooting Kalimachi and especially of how recent events unfolded, on that grounds of how a lot of these, since you also talked about like these groups want the coverage, want you to put them in national dailies. Of how do you fact check? Because some of the things that they might be telling you is propaganda. So, as a researcher, that you need to cross check. So, how do you cross check? Because there's no way you can go back and see what happened in Israel or sorry, what happened in Iraq or what happened in Syria. How do you go and do that?
Look, that those excellent questions. I'm really glad you brought them up since I did not touch upon them. So, see, the first one, the whole idea of open source intelligence is very skewed of what it is. Right? Open source intelligence largely is using using maps, using satellite imagery, and using those kind of tools uh, to, let's say, uh, create databases on strikes, on missile strikes, on bombings, on so on and so forth. So open source intelligence is technically what you are creating. It's not what you are consuming. There's a difference to that, right? And look, there are some excellent courses now, especially they're free courses online on how to conduct open source intelligence. It's a trial and error thing. You need to be very I'm not great, for example, at using satellite imagery and maps when it comes to OSINT, right? So I read up a lot and follow people like Bellingcat who've been doing it for a long period of time, and have had I think they also have some good talks online on how they conduct open source research, and they do it in a fairly safe and ethical manner from what I understand. It's they're not breaking into anything, they're not hacking into anything. It's all used with existing tools that are available to you and me also. It's just how you use those tools, right? And you have to understand, a lot of these OSINT things that you see are people with technical backgrounds. So the engineers, they are software engineers, they know how the Internet of Things works. And as I said, I'm not very good with that. So, you know, study people like Bellingcat. It's I'm just giving sort of like a starting position on what it is. It's time consuming, right? It requires a specific skill set, mostly, as I said, a technical background skill set. But other than that, it's I don't classify getting access to, let's say, jihadist materials or materials released by the Islamic State and all that as open source intelligence. It's it used to be maybe at a point of time, but it's extremely closed now. It's not easy, predominantly because the platforms now abide by certain rules. So if, let's say, an organization is banned as a terror group by the US, someone like Twitter and Facebook are sort of not obliged per se, but have taken it as policy that they will use these listings to determine what kind of content can go down or can be taken off. So if Al Qaeda is listed in the US Department of Justice terror list, Facebook and Twitter are going to take it down. So it's again, it a lot of it at from my experience from the contacts we made earlier. So there are of course places like Telegram where you can still find these kind of things, these kind of rooms in an open environment. Um it's a lot of trial and error. There are a lot of bots now, so a lot of non-human distribution systems that these groups like Islamic State or these sympathizing groups to Islamic State have created, which has made somehow distribution of their propaganda a bit more easier again using bots. So that's one place where young researchers, I think, can look for these things in a fairly safe environment, because it sometimes just comes up as a search if it's being promoted by a bot. But ultimately it comes down to how well you know these groups in itself, right? They are not publishing anything as Al Nabba. It doesn't, there's no room called Al Nabba magazine and you just go and subscribe. So it all comes down, even within these platforms, they will still link you to a third party to get what you want. It's not necessarily within those platforms. Platforms increasingly are only used as distribution systems. And these groups are also very fast decentralizing from the internet itself. So they're creating their own ecosystems, which makes it very hard for tech companies to take it down. So I predict in the next 2-3 years, you will see these kind of propaganda materials coming up fairly more regularly, as it used to happen in 2013 and 14. I mean, Al Qaeda has an app which is hosted on an Al Qaeda server. So you can't, unless you take it out with a missile or something, you can't take it off because it's decentralized. It's not hosted on Amazon servers, or it's not hosted on XYZ servers. It's hosted on an AQ server. So you can download the app without going to an app store or a Google Play or something. Right. So this is going to happen much and much more and more. And I think in the next 2-3 years, we may see much more robust distribution system by these kind of groups again, after a lull period which has happened in the past 2-3 years when platforms were forced literally to take action. And now these groups have the know-how and the money to create their own sort of servers and host their own propagandas on there. So it's at the moment, I mean, trial and error. You need to know how to I mean, you need to know how to search, of course, but once you get into an ecosystem as well, it's how do you survive in there, right? If you're just a lurker, for example, you manage to get into a pro-Islamic State group where they're posting, and you're a lurker, they see, okay, you've been here for 4 days, you haven't said anything. You haven't said anything, you haven't recited anything, you haven't quoted anything from the Quran, whatever, you'll get kicked out. So how do you, even if you get in, how do you survive? So you need to know the group, you need to know the theology, you need to know the ideology before you start thinking it as a game. Treat it as research. It is not something fun, it is not time pass, it is extremely serious business. Unless you are involved in actual proper research, do not try to attempt and gain access to these groups.
And how do you, the second part, how do you understand the materials you provided? It's, I mean, it's not fake or it's not propaganda.
Yeah, okay. I
And
mean, look,
also, I'll just add one more part to this. You also see, for example, the recent Israel-Palestine also open a lot of this doors of confusion that, for example, Al Jazeera might have a different point of view for the entire conflict, and so does a lot of pro-Israel media groups as well. So for people who was consuming this information, gets a lot of confusion because who has the information comes there, and it's no way you can go to the Gaza Strip and find yourself out there.
okay, both good questions. First one is a very, there is no single answer to it. It comes down to your sensibilities and how well do you know the subject matter. The good part about research in a public policy think tank like ORF, or if you are at a university, is that you are accorded time. There is no deadline to post an article, right? You want 2 months, you take 2 months, that kind of thing, right? So, for example, some of the things that came up with the whole Rukmini Kalimaki issue with the New York Times was some of the documentations that she managed to access. Were they real? Were they not real? But the story still went out. Was the crisis point, right? And it's very difficult. I mean, it's not difficult to manipulate documentation. It's not difficult to distribute manipulated documentation, and it's very hard to confirm if a document is real or not. Because, as you said, you can't just land up at a geography and say, okay, is this real or is this fake? Can you please tell me? So it comes down to a judgment a lot. It comes down to your rigor as a researcher a lot. Even if you have 5% of doubt of the authenticity, let's say, of a document, I mean, you should take that 5% very seriously and junk it if you can't if you can't verify it. One of the best things to do, and a lot of people that don't, a lot of researchers in India don't, is access court documents, right? So a lot of cases eventually go to court. There are charge sheets available often on the NIA website and so on and so forth. Go through it. There are lots of half of my book came out through charge sheets. I sat down, went through 300 pages of complete inane garbage, very poorly written charge sheets with riddled with mistakes. But they still have information, right? So the charge sheets are not academic document. It's a policing document. So you have to go sit through a lot of um, garbage to find what you are seeking, the information that you are seeking. And that's what research is about. It's about time. You have to know your subject matter. You can't don't don't confuse it with journalism. It's not. Don't confuse it with your personal um, um, understanding of all these topics. It's it, as I said, I think a lot of young folks, young researchers, see it as a very exciting opportunity. It is, and specifically in India, because there are tremendous gaps, right? Especially on, let's say, on online radicalization. How many research institutes and universities are doing work on it, right? And if you do get into it, at some point a year down the line, you will get access to everything that you're seeking to right now, because you will learn how to get access to it. You will learn how to get access to it safely, how to handle this information, right? Just getting access to a newsletter for the sake of look, I've got the access to a Islamic State newsletter is not the correct way of going about it, and you should not be doing it. But and coming back to the verifying thing, is it's hit and miss. You'll win some, you'll lose some. So you'll have to have uh, the stomach to fail and succeed at the same time. Is because a lot of this information that comes out seems legitimate. Verifying it is almost next to impossible often, right? um, Even if you see some of the information that comes out of a very small ecosystem like Kashmir, where Islamic State Hind province has only done like what in 2028 attacks or something. But those 8 attacks, out of those 8 attacks, 4 were claimed by ISH. They were also claimed by the Popular Front. Who did it? How did it happen? Ultimately, who was behind it? It's all conjecture, and this is a very small group of people. But we don't have access to the geography. We have limited access to the online presence, and we have to make do with the information that you have. So, after, let's say, 5, 6 years of being a researcher in this field, you start to smell bullshit after a point. So your radar becomes much more tuned to what's right, what's wrong, where it is coming from, what handle is it being distributed from. I remember, when South Al Hind started publishing during the Delhi riots last year, January, February, whatever it was. In the middle, an entire issue was released of South Al Hind. I can't remember what was on the cover, but it was something of a departure from Islamic State thinking. And that issue came, and it came to my inbox. I read it cover to cover, as I do with all these issues, and something just felt off. So I did not catalog it yet. I wanted to go through it a couple of times more, because the argumentation was very off. The language was a little different. Number of typos was almost zero, which never happens. And turned out 3 weeks later, that Islamic State in itself said this is a fake issue. That issue was never actually distributed by the Islamic State, but it came through the same channels I get my usual Islamic State issues from. Right. So, it just because you can't get comfortable in any sort of how you're handling information, you always have to question everything that's coming your way. Right. So, and research institutes allow you that. So I say time is very important. You should not be in a hurry to publish something. Oh, they mentioned this in Al Naba, and this is the story now. No, you have to wait, especially if you're a researcher, because research allows you time. So take advantage of that ecosystem.
So, one just small follow-up for all those people who are listening to this, since you have mentioned a couple of times about using either a university or an organization like a think tank. Uh, are especially if you since you're working from home, this is something you can answer better. Is the cyber security capabilities of a computer is well designed enough to access such information? Because a lot of malware threat comes in.
Yeah. I mean, look, I use multiple devices for multiple things, right? So, my usual phone, which I use to call family, friends, whatever, is not something I use Telegram on, for example, right? The phone I use Telegram on has nothing but Telegram on. So even if there is malware, feel free. There's nothing on the device. So I mean, you have to, you know, uh, devise your own plans. There's no universal sort of way of going about it. You have to devise your own plans. It depends on the state you are in. Does the state's laws protect you well from cybersecurity, from hacking, from being manipulated by cyber entities? Does it not? You have to be, you know, in tune with those things. Uh, it helps if you're a researcher, let's say for 6, 7 years. Usually the agencies know you, they know your work, they know what you're doing, because you are in the public domain, right? So it's not a problem per se. But when it comes to cybersecurity, it's an increasingly problematic area, because securing devices is getting more and more expensive. Uh, you create a security today, the other side can break it in 2 days or 3 days or whatever it is, right? So you always have to be on top of your game. Most Indian institutes have terrible cybersecurity, and including uh, so even the work I do at ORF is, when I'm in office, is very limited. I don't use PCs. I don't use office PCs for this kind of work, right? So I have separate mobile devices, which I consider much more safer than PCs that are connected to larger, uh, you know, uh, LAN systems or internet systems and so on and so forth. But it ultimately it comes down to there's no universal rule. It comes down to how you operate and how you feel that the information that you're operating with is safe. Which is why, again, coming back to my one of my initial points, there's no romanticism to this. It's serious business. Don't try and go out and do random searches on this. There are now safe spaces, even if you're a young researcher like jihadology, sign up for that. It's you can access most of these things in a safe and secure environment, and it gives you tremendous um, access to things for you to hone up your skills, your research skills, to understand better, to understand these groups better, of what their thinking is, and so on and so forth. So now that there are these kind of avenues specifically designed for researchers, take advantage of that instead of the more romanticized parts of how we collect these data.
Yeah. Can we have just one last question? Actually, two in two parts. Yeah. So the first part is about since you're mentioning in one of the other instances about how a lot of groups that if you go into might ask you to recite a verse of Quran or something that you need to prove. And this is one question that we have got from one person, and he was asking about this that do you need to have a background in theologies or at least a primer on Islam to study Islamic terrorism? To understand what their ideology is about and why they're propagating it. That's the first part. And the second part is uh, I have heard this from one of the intelligence officer, and he says that a lot of non-intelligent people, when talk about terrorism or talk about counter-terrorism, in fact, it doesn't make sense to him because these people do not have access to a lot of these data that they had access to. So they might just be scratching the surface. So which I don't agree with. But uh, in on this level, do you think that a person like you, or a person like me, who probably comes from a very different background, not into intelligence agencies, can actually become a person who can actually, like you are at the moment, like a go-to person whenever things comes to ISIS, uh, and your analysis are actually looked upon by a lot of other people. So how do you beat that force? Because you're not coming from that quintessential background of intelligence, and whatever you say will be taken sacrosanct.
Look, I'll start with the second question first. No one is saying that any researcher will have ever have more capacity than an intelligence officer or an intelligence agency. I think if and no one is claiming to do that, right? I mean, you can't say that a researcher sitting in New Delhi has more capacity than military intelligence and working in Kashmir. That's just not going to happen. The point is not that. I mean, the point is that whatever we work on is still relatively in the public domain. We are not going. No one is going to to Mosul or something to collect data and stuff right now. People did that, journalists mostly, but researchers hardly, anyone was going to risk their life and land up in a complete war zone. But I mean, look, it's again, I'm not sure where the intelligence officer or the former intelligence officer was coming from. There is no researcher has those capacities, but they work in a very sort of very limited access, and that access also came only right now. And I mean, unfortunately or fortunately, a lot of Indian intelligence took their own sweet time to scale up their cyber game, their digital game. While a lot of the others managed to just get two or three engineers together and figure out how where what was coming from, where what is available, who's talking, who's not talking, and so on and so forth. So if just that part is problematic to them, then it's a problem within the Indian intelligence agency. It's not anything to do with us. You needed to, following trends is never easy because policy will always be two steps behind technology. It's just how the nature of game is going to be. So if you're counter to um, uh, a online trend of uh, propaganda by a terror group is uh, you know that a researcher managed to, I don't know, talk or get something first and published it or made it public or something like that. That's just how it is going to be now. I mean, and plus, I mean, there's absolutely no doubt in anyone's mind that they are even 0.1% to what capacities and intelligence he will have. Right? It's two different, extremely different worlds. So, I mean, I'm not sure where that argument even fits in. Sorry, I forgot the first question. What was it again?
It was on how much of a background you need in Islam to carry your
Uh, I
research on.
mean, as much as you can is good. You can't understand ideology or theology of these groups if you are only going to concentrate on the kinetic part of it, right? So if you're only going to concentrate on what they have attacked, who they have attacked, how they have attacked, how many people they've killed, what is happening to them from military level, that's all well and good. That's fine. But if you really want to get into the nitty gritties of it, you need to learn about theologies. You need to learn about what the role the shuras play in the Taliban's thinking. You need to learn about the Islamic State's hierarchy. You need to learn about all these things. Al Qaeda was much more kinetic than most of them, right? So theology was significant part, but getting rid of the Americans and the Israelis was a larger part. So it there are two things. So if you can, of course, if the researchers who are listening in and just starting off can do it. First is language. It's hard, but if you can go out, learn your Arabic, learn your Urdu or whatever it is, it will make your life much more easier, and it will give you much, uh, I mean, a lot of weight as a researcher if you can access these. Um, uh, I mean, if you have the language skills, and then you can access these kind of propaganda materials and all, because then you'll understand it, and you can go much deeper into the history of these groups, where they come from. They almost always come from certain preachers, smaller, much smaller ecosystem that then get either co-opted or they snowball into something else. But this one book called The Caravan by Thomas Heghammer, which a lot of people who are looking into this field should read, uh, purely from point of language, research, and the depth of how it should be done and what you should be striving to. Your end product should be this, right? This is exactly what the intelligence will also read before doing anything, right? So despite having all the all the tools of the trade and so on and so forth. So there are a fair few of these academic outputs that in the field of Islamic studies going and merging into terrorism studies and security studies and so on and so forth. It's all interconnected, but language is something that a lot of people, I mean, no one suggested it to me when I was starting up, and I wish someone would have, because learning languages is anyway an Achilles heel for me. But if you want to get into this seriously, get the language skills behind you. It'll take you a long way, both in legitimacy and just as a researcher.
Yeah, so this is the last question before I end it. So this
Yeah.
is the most requested question that we had. So about when you write, for example, the expert speak for ORF, or for example, a commentary, or even a research paper. So there's a lot of information that comes to your table. As throughout the conversation, we found that a lot of information is there. So how do you understand what are the parts? So firstly, how do you understand that this is the flow that you want to carry on with the paper? These are
Yeah.
the information that you want to, because there's a lot of information that are not required for that. So how do you develop it? And for a young researcher, this is how to analyze an incident that's unfolding and develop that analytical skill.
Right. That's a good question. See, it's there's no easy sort of answer to it. Ultimately, you will develop your own skill set of how you want to handle information, right? But there are certain sort of um, everything should be questioned. Anything that comes to your table should be fair game to be questioned, whether it's coming from a paper written by Kissinger or something written by your local panwala. Doesn't really matter, right? Everything needs to be questioned. And when you're handling primary data, this approach really helps, right? So first and foremost, like let's say if I'm handling, I'm doing a long-term project right now on South Al Hind, right? So I first and foremost know that this is propaganda, right? So you have to not get into a weird Stockholm syndrome kind of situation where you start taking it as literal literature, right? Or literal sort of literature that can be used for academic work. You have to understand, you have to remain cognizant of the fact this is propaganda. And this is your primary research. So then once you approach it from that perspective, uh, read line by line, always make notes uh, on pen and paper, right? Not on your laptop, not on your go old school on this, right? It really, really helps. Make notes, use sticky notes. Um, Once you start getting into a habit of reading every word with a pen under it, literally like a school child, like going by word by word by word by word, you will realize slowly your analytical skills automatic. You will start picking out things that you will not picking out 3 months earlier, 5 months earlier, 6 months earlier, right? So, um, so I mean that's at least works for me. But largely how you handle information, it comes, it comes with just working in the field for a long period of time. There's no sort of fast way to it. And also don't try to be an expert on everything. This is something that plagues India really badly. If you are interested in this field, that's it. I don't your views on India's relations with Pakistan or India's relations with China or India's relations with the US are irrelevant. Don't get into it. If you have taken a field, if you have taken a silo, sit in the silo, right? Become the king of that silo. Don't try to spread yourself thin. Don't, we, I mean, that, I mean, people will disagree with it, but they're disciplines, right? In the sense that, okay, fine, you're an IR scholar, so you have a whole world view and all that. And that's fine, but if that is your approach and that is your interest, then you stick to that, right? Don't get into CT studies. Don't try and have an opinion on you can read, I mean, as part of your interest, but don't pontificate. uh, and that's something that I do try to do as much as I can. You will not see me writing on Indo-Pacific, for example. Very rare. I mean, even I've written once, I think, from a CT perspective. So that also very sort of hesitantly. So just get into your material, get into your subject line, and then stick to it. Because any I mean, all of these issues, if you're talking about terrorism or counterterrorism, and specifically radicalization, there is enough out there to keep you busy for a lifetime. There is absolutely no way where you can stand and say, i I think I know, how this works or that works and all. It's just not how it works. I My book, which came out in 2019, at this point of time is 40% out of date now, right? It's just been a year. And I knew that while writing, because things change very fast, right? And you have to be on top of these things while they're changing very fast. So it's remain committed to the topic that you have taken, and then become the champion of that topic. Don't try to spread yourself too thin. That I will be this foreign policy analyst. So anything that happens beyond India's borders, I will have an opinion on it, which I see a lot of young scholars doing right now. I don't know why or what's happening, but that's not a good way to go about if you're serious about research and stuff. And look for nooks and cracks in research also. Like if you see the paper that I did last year on de-radicalization programs in India. De-radicalization programs had been there for nearly 4 years now. There was nothing on it. I had nothing to go on. So for 4 years, no one had this thought that wait, Maharashtra has it, Kerala has it. They're making claims. What is it about? How does it work? Because de-radicalization is something which is you are literally reprogramming a person or trying to reprogram a person, right? It has ramifications, like large ramifications for societies and all that kind of stuff. So, I did field work there. I was in Maharashtra for 3 weeks. I visited certain communities and areas where some of the Kalyan boys went from in Thane. And it took 6, 7 months to do a 6,000 word paper, right? And it takes time. So if you're doing it thoroughly enough, you will realize 1 year is also not often enough. So, don't spread yourself thin. Pick up something that you're really passionate about within the field of foreign policy and IR, and then commit yourself to it. I think India also needs those kind of scholars at our universities who will pick one topic and just go gung ho on it. It will really benefit the discourse.
Yeah. Thank you actually for that answer. And I think most of the topics that a lot of the scholars actually or young researchers who have question come and ask you, I think it's covered over here. So you can finally say, I've answered all of them in one piece. You can go and have a look. And for all the young scholars who are watching this, probably not to ask for, probably if you're not in a position, as you mentioned, that to always get into a group where you get the Samak News Agency updates, probably go and follow experts who have the success and regularly post on Twitter or on other social media platforms about attacks or other places. So thank you so much, Kabir, for taking your time.
Thanks, man. Of course,
Uh,
no problem.
and if you want to just give any parting thoughts to the researchers out there, one or two lines, and we can end this.
Just please join us. We are short of people. Please take up IR, take up foreign policy, take up counterterrorism studies from universities to think tanks. We need more of these people getting into this. It's a viable career option now. There are options. There are think tanks in Delhi coming up, new ones also, like in the past 1 year. So it's satisfying topics to work on, and but yeah. Choose them wisely according to your interests.
Yeah. Thank you so much again.